Welcome to the Rebuilding Arizona Civics podcast. This podcast aims to share our journey of sustaining Arizona's interest in reforms to civic education by implementing the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. This work is being done by an amazing group of Arizona civic teacher leaders and overseen by the Center for Political Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. I'm your host, Liz Evans, Director of Civic Education at Arizona State University, and I'll be interviewing Arizona teachers and thought leaders in civic education. We hope you enjoy our journey to make Arizona a national civics renewal model. Hello, listeners. This is part 2 of our looking at the 5 design challenges. So don't forget to check out part 1. And on this second one, we're looking at design challenges 3, 4, and 5. Enjoy.
Third design challenge, which is connected with theme 4, a new government and constitution. In this one, we're simultaneously celebrating and critiquing compromise. So when we look at this specific design challenge, how do we simultaneously teach the value and the danger of compromise in a free, diverse, and self-governing society?
Well, there's the trouble, isn't it? That's the trouble. We have a free. I mean, ideally, we have a very diverse society, and we have limited government, or we'd really like to have limited government. We'd like to keep it limited, and the problem is that the diversity piece, the enfranchisement of people, and the involvement of people as civic actors means that because we are so diverse, we must compromise. We have no choice but to. Like, we don't have Pharaoh who hands down dictates, and I hope we don't ever want that. You know, we have to figure out a way to roll the ball forward, even though you've got people who see things very, very differently from one another. And so on the one hand, compromise it's absolutely essential. And yet there are many cases in our history where you can look back and say, well, you know, who decides whether it's compromise or kicking a can down the road? You know, is the Missouri Compromise kicking a can down the road, or is it avoiding a bloody war? You know, there are lots of examples. And I think that because this is where the blending of the civics, or the marrying to a point of the civics and the government, the political, or not civics and government, the political science and the history is so rich. It illuminates both, because that issue of compromise and how it's all about us figuring out where the break point that where do we decide the compromise stops and where do we decide to give up things? That's something we've done for 240 some odd. That's just what we do as Americans, for better or for worse. And we have many, many examples to discuss, very complex examples from our history to discuss, to help students get their head around this notion of compromise is baked into the system. And that is inherently neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It's a thing. The consequences of a given compromise, that's where we can debate, but compromise is part of it. So we have to learn about it. We have to embrace it. We don't have a choice.
I love, Jeremy, how you talked about compromise is baked into the system. Because when you think about it, I think Federalist 51 lays this out perfectly, this idea that we have a separation of powers and we have checks and balances in the system. Our Constitution sets up our 3 branches of government. Each is chosen in a different way. And within our legislative branch, even that is split. And originally when the Constitution was ratified, of course, it was even more split because your Senate was appointed as opposed to directly elected. We also have that compromise in the system when you look at the idea of federalism and the powers of the state versus the powers of the national government, where they overlap, where they separate. So it's an important part of the system. And even though it's an important part of the system, we can look at it as beneficial in many ways. but we can also critique some of the decisions that have been made. And I think it's really, this is a great design challenge because it really teaches students those civic dispositions or values, because compromise is a value. It's a value of our system. Critique is also a value of our system. We are a system that is born of dissent and critique. So looking at this, students are learning the civic dispositions and values, how to listen to opposing viewpoints, because you can't come to compromise unless you lay it all out on the table, listen to opposing viewpoints, find value in those that are maybe politically divergent from your own viewpoints, and coming up with that common ground, maybe those ideas that connect all of us together, which are very, very important and addressed somewhat in design challenge number 2. Interesting side note is this design challenge came about, it was the first design challenge that was created, and it came about over a 3-week debate on whether we should refer to our country as a democracy or a republic in the documents for the Educating for American Democracy initiative. And as we worked through the process of how we would refer to our nation, this design challenge was born because we came to this idea of compromise together on the creation of the name, taking from the pros of a democratic form of government, why those who wanted to call it a democracy, what were those values inherent? And then also, what was it about the limitations and the barriers that a republic gave us in terms of narrowing government down to have those different fences around government, the structure of government. So I love this design challenge as well, and I love the origin story behind it.
Yeah, I remember when you had shared that story with me, Tammy, about this design challenge and the naming of our nation, as you called it. And I thought that was such a cool way that this design challenge came about. And I'll just echo some of the same sentiments that both Jeremy and Tammy discussed, in that this particular design challenge really represents a major challenge in of itself of our American experiment, in that it's this idea of compromise, of which our students must learn, strategies around compromise, the benefits of compromise. And it's, again, this balance, right? So having our shared institutions, but at the same time might have a differentiation in our pathways on how to necessarily achieve some of our goals. But I think this design challenge says it best, in that it's both recognizing the value and the danger of compromise. And I know, Jeremy, you spoke a little bit of that danger in the sense of compromise, and that I think even now we can look at a lot of our current times, and just that alone, current events have really proven the fragility of compromise and the fragility of our self-government, not just here in the US, but other democracies around the world. And so this design challenge really focuses on that importance of compromise, and helps students kind of solidify, again, the benefits of compromise, not just for themselves, but our society and nation as a whole.
So again, this ties perfectly into design challenge number 4. This is tied in with theme 5, institutional and social transformation, a series of refounding ? So this design challenge is civic honesty and reflective patriotism, which I love that phrasing, reflective patriotism. So this one looks at how can we offer an account of U.S. constitutional democracy that is simultaneously honest about the wrongs of the past without falling into cynicism, and appreciative of the founding of the United States without tipping into adulation.
Yeah, I will echo your same appreciation and love for that phrase, reflective patriotism, because when I first read that too, I had to sit with that for a bit, right? It's such a kind of, to this, theme's point, such a reflection, inflection point in looking at our country's history and then now present day. And so I'm going to actually invite our listeners for a moment just to think also about this reflective patriotism in the context of our American story and how difficult it is to tell our American story. And it comes back, I think, to what Tammy pointed out in terms of us being a very diverse nation and reflecting on all the different views, experiences that honestly people from around the world have collectively brought into this country to layer on the existing stories and experiences that were here, many times before. So just to reiterate what was said earlier, that this design challenge, I think, really brings in a lot of our previous design challenges about the historical representation, what Tammy alluded to about students feeling seen. And that's that reflective patriotism in that we're not shying away from the past. We're also being very honest about it and moving forward with a forward-looking lens in the present as a collective union. And so I think that, from this diversity and that we've created this nation where, despite our many challenges and downfalls that we've had, we actually have many things to also be proud of and to really honor in terms of that patriotism piece. So I think that this design challenge does a really nice job of bringing in both a lot of these difficulties, but then carving out a pathway forward that is, again, honest, but also appreciative.
I love what you said, Tara, about this, this idea of paving a path forward. And I really think that this is what this design challenge is about. It's this idea that you can have a love of your country, but still have an honest reckoning with shortcomings and imperfections. So this design challenge really shows that there is a false binary to either just adulation and blind patriotism and ignoring past mistakes. But also, on the other hand, we don't want students to become defeated and to see, well, we've done all these horrible things. Let's throw out, everything that has been good as part of the process. So this one talks about this idea of that we can evolve and grow as human beings, and that historically we have evolved and grown. And part of that is our ability to reflect on our past and to see our mistakes so we don't make those mistakes in the future. And I kind of think of this one example when we teach about historically Japanese incarceration, and we look at what happened to our Japanese American brothers and sisters during World War II. We know that was a low point in terms of due process, individual rights, a time of racism. But fast forward to after the attacks on 9/11, and there was discussion happening about what do we do? Do we round up and arrest those who are tied to Middle Eastern countries or Americans who are Muslim in this country? But there were voices that came out. One of those voices was our president at the time, who said, basically, we have to look at our history. And last time we did that with Japanese incarceration, what are the lessons we learned from that? And I really think that reflective patriotism, that idea of looking at the shortcoming of the past and then applying a situation that happened in the future and knowing the path forward from that, as opposed to ignoring what happened in the past and making similar mistakes with it. So I do think that this is an exceptionally important design challenge. And I think it's important too because of political climate in our country and our state right now. I think this is a good balance to this idea of looking at your history and your governmental institutions and celebrating the things that are good and have been good, but also keeping an eye on the fact that we are trying to create that more perfect union. And to create a more perfect union, we have to better ourselves and our institutions each time.
I think this also opens up the door for teachers to help students recognize that there are a few things that are all good or all bad. there are a few people, in fact, maybe even nobody, who is all good or all bad. Like, I can personally not be a fan of Thomas Jefferson, the man, or all of what he wrote, but I can hold up some of the things that he wrote as being timeless and essential to the American mind, as he called it. I'm able to do that. Actually, anybody can do that. And the way I differentiate these is it's possible to be a patriot without being a nationalist. It's possible to find the good and the best in what the country seeks to be and try to promote those things, without falling into the trap of, like we've said, just, either being cynical or kind of a mindless adulation. And I think that's really important. And again, helping students learn, and it's not that difficult. Like, recognize that, look, and I hate to use the word because I feel like it gets overused, complex. But people and things are complex, and teaching students to recognize that that there's oftentimes, you find things that we judge to be good or bad now, mixed together. So I think there's some terrific opportunities, and as Tara and Tammy have said, some really great American ideas and ideals, that we can help students learn about and develop a mature love of country, where they seek to, again, promote those things as they move forward as civic actors, while recognizing that, the world's full of all kinds of people, all kinds of things.
I love that. It's possible to be a patriot without being a nationalist. I think we should put that on billboards everywhere with your picture next to it.
I'm gonna get a big tattoo, like in Gothic letters, on my back, across my shoulder blades, like that, or not.
We await said tattoo.
Ain't gonna happen.
Well, our last design challenge ties in themes 6 and 7. And this one is balancing the concrete with the abstract. So how can we support instructors in helping students move between concrete, narrative, and chronological learning, and thematic and abstract or conceptual learning?
So I'm going to start with this design challenge. One of my favorite songs on Sesame Street was "One of These Things Is Not Like the Other." And I think this design challenge is the one that's not like the other. While the other design challenges talk about the what we teach, this really is a design challenge that talks about how do we teach history and civics. So this design challenge really emphasizes the tension to approaches taking the teaching of history and civics. Do we go the concrete narrative chronological structure, the what, or do we do it through themes and concepts, which really is more the why? And this design challenge tells you it's not mutually exclusive. Robust programs use a combination of both thematic and chronological, because you must understand the chronology, things like continuity and change over time, cause and effect, comparing people, places, and events in order to understand history and civics. But the themes, how you organize that information to retain meaning and create connection, is important as well. And the themes allow students to be able to look at topics across grade bands, across years. They allow the themes to be really a tether. I always talk about how when you teach the facts, it's like a balloon. And if you don't have something to tether it to, it might float away. If you have the themes, students can tether the information to the themes, the chronological information, and then those ideas, instead of floating away, actually grow and prosper within students as they move from year to year. And one of the things I've been looking at is this idea of, in science, they have cross-cutting concepts. I really think our themes become the cross-cutting concepts of civics and history.
Yeah, I think the idea that that this is that these are mutually exclusive. The idea of going more conceptual or abstract or more concrete, that these are somehow mutually exclusive, is a false argument. It has to be both. Students, like, I mean, if take the example of Bloom's taxonomy, you cannot analyze unless you have facts. You cannot evaluate or synthesize nothing. On the other hand, if you just stop at like, Bloom's 2, and you don't go any higher than that, then you just have at best memorization, which I suppose is better than nothing. But again, if you have nothing to analyze, then what's going on? So you have to be able to do both of these things, and find a way to do that across grade bands. And I've always thought that if there is a reason behind the facts, the crunchy stuff, then the students are more apt to remember the crunchy stuff because they're doing something with it. And so there has to be that graceful balance of the two. And yeah, I agree. This one is not like the others, but it's absolutely essential. And it's tied to, it officially says it applies to a people in the world and a people with contemporary debates and possibility. It applies across the board. It has to sit and weave through the base of all of this, because at the end of it, ideally, you want future citizens, our civic actors, people in their 20s and 30s and 40s and onward, you want them to understand, for example, like, okay, how does a bill become a law? And how is what role does the Senate actually play in the confirmation process of presidential appointees? Like, they have to understand that as a process before they can watch what's going on in the news regarding their elected officials and formulate a valid opinion that they can go act on in accordance with and related to their values and their interests and ideas. If there is a reason for the facts, if that concrete information has a purpose and is used in the classroom, then the students are far more likely to take the time to learn it and far more likely to retain it.
I think, Tammy, you brought up a good point of this, this long-standing debate that we have around teaching history, whether it's better to teach it in that chronological timeline or whether it's better to teach in this, thematic units. And honestly, I think that this debate, it really does need to be abandoned. Instead of having, again, that, false dichotomy of either one or the other, instead, this approach should really be braided together. There is this chronological piece that's being braided in with themes, so that, I recall as a teacher, this only teaching it chronologically, you're stressed to cover, this entire timeline, and you're just checking the box. I'm teaching this, date, time, place, and, you might do an activity around that, but it's this kind of surface level learning of facts that Jeremy alluded to. And so I think by braiding these together, you're going to have that deeper learning by interweaving that thematic piece as well. And so that is always, better for student engagement, of course. So I think it goes back also to the whole EAD roadmap of connecting, history and civics, that we're weaving those together as we are both this chronological and thematic approach to teaching the social studies more broadly. And I think another point we need to recognize is that we must also, just be aware we live in a very globalized world, a very globalized society. And so when we are teaching something, whether it is history or current day, that this reach really encompasses more broadly just, a timeline of, perhaps a time and a place, an event, but also the theme, the relevancy to not only other places in the world, but also students themselves and perhaps their families. And so I think, as Tammy pointed out, taking a step back, that this design challenge is really an inflection point for teachers to take hold of a different pedagogical approach in teaching history and civics, and to perhaps abandon some of those, previously, either ors in how they teach in their classroom.
Is there anything else when we're looking at these design challenges that we want to say specifically to educators who are looking at the EAD and wondering, these are challenging, and maybe they're in a community that doesn't want to talk about reflective patriotism, or maybe these challenges just feel kind of overwhelming. Do you have any last words that we could give to teachers?
Yeah, I would take a look. I mean, they're not long. The nice thing about these on the EAD site, they're only a few sentences long each, and so it's not a huge ask to take a little bit of time and just read through them. What I would do is, especially with the first four, is I would pick one that seems to just resonate with you, for whatever reason. Pick one that interests you. And then I would think about a couple of your lessons or units that you have taught over the years. We all had those units or lessons that you come back to. You say, oh, this was effective. I thought this worked well. And you tweak it a little bit each year because you have different kids. But I would take one of the design challenges and I would take a look at one of your lessons or units and think about, okay, how does this, if I looked through this design challenge as a lens, how would my unit or lesson look? If I used it as a mirror, what would I see in my unit or lesson? Just use it as a way to think about, I think the really easy one, the reflective patriotism one, I've seen teachers who, they teach the founding, as if the founders were a bunch of, marble statues. They weren't human beings. They were marble statues. And there's only glory and radiance that comes from them. And I've also seen other teachers teach them who are these were all horrible human beings and nothing good came of them. Neither of those things are correct. Neither of those things are really defensible, honestly. So I would take one of these, and that's what I would do. I would just go through some of your units, and I would look at them and think about, what might I change? What might I include or change in terms of assessment, in terms of reading, whatever. But I would not try to take all of them at once and one bite at a time, like it takes to eat the elephant. That's how I would approach it.
Yeah. Two thoughts about the design challenges. And I think, Liz, you brought up a good point in that, some communities might be more receptive to some of these design challenges than others. And I think something to recognize in that is, one, these design challenges don't offer solutions. And it's really up to the teacher and the context that teacher is teaching in to, again, not even for the teacher to create some type of solution, but at least to address the design challenge. You're not going to be solving anything, like world hunger in your classroom over that semester by addressing a design challenge, but it's more in just defining the challenge, recognizing the challenge, and perhaps having your students really come up with creative ideas, thought pieces around that challenge. Again, not necessarily solutions, but just also as the teacher recognizing that whatever your students might be working on in terms of a design challenge with the roadmap is going to be vastly different than a student across the state or across the country. And it's going to be very contextualized and based upon your students, the students' families, perhaps, as Jeremy alluded to, your own interests and expertise as a teacher. And then, of course, whatever the curriculum is that you're teaching. And so I think by recognizing those two things, one, it's contextualized, and two, it's not asking for a solution, but just having your students think through these different challenges is going to be beneficial.
Thank you, my wonderful task force chairs. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. I think that we are at a place now that we've really hit on the key components of the EAD, and I'm looking forward to digging more into it and talking about how we're going to implement it here in Arizona. So thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can find the Center for Political Thought and Leadership on social media channels. Please subscribe to our podcast wherever you find your favorite podcast. And on a last note, the views and opinions expressed on this podcast do not necessarily represent the Center for Political Thought and Leadership or Arizona State University.